3 of them, at the door. Hugo noticed the tusks first, not because he was afraid, but because the light from the hall caught them at just the right angle, a flash of wet ivory against dark green skin. He set down the rag. Behind the woman stood 2 girls, the older one with a hand on the younger one's shoulder, the younger one looking at him with eyes the color of amber. All 3 were wet from the knees down. The road to Bor turned to mud the moment the temperature dropped past freezing, and it stayed that way until the first real snow. The mud was thick, red-brown, the kind that sucked at boots. "A room," the woman said. She didn't phrase it as a question. She put a travel document on the counter, folded twice, sealed, with the stamp of the border office still intact. Beside it she placed coins, the right amount. She had counted them before she walked in. Hugo looked at the document, looked at the money. He didn't look at the girls. "2nd floor, 3rd door on the left," he said. "The key's already in the lock." He took the coins, dropped them into the tin box under the counter without counting. She watched him do it. He couldn't tell what she made of it. He took down a key anyway, the spare, and held it out. Her hand closed around it carefully, like she was expecting him to pull it back. The girl with the copper bracelet picked up the big backpack before her mother could turn back for it. She didn't say anything. She just took it and followed. The little one, Sibba, he would learn her name later, stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked up at him. Her wooden bear figurine swung at her neck. She fastened one button on her jacket that her mother hadn't bothered with. Then she went upstairs. Hugo went back to the kitchen. He was 20 minutes into the soup, turnip, a bone, some dried herbs from the autumn store, when he heard the front door. He didn't go out immediately. He knew the sound of that door better than he knew most things. The way it dragged at the bottom corner when someone pushed it in a hurry. When it came out, he found Edmar Toss standing at the counter with his arms crossed. Toss ran the other inn on Bor's main street, the Warm Hearth, 3 years newer and half the size. He had a square face and a way of breathing through his nose that sounded like disapproval. Hugo. He said the name like a piece of information. "There are orcs upstairs." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't try to. "The townsfolk are displeased." He paused. "I thought you should know." Hugo looked at him. Toss was younger by a few years, heavier through the chest, with the kind of confidence that came from never having lost anything he couldn't afford to replace. Hugo had known him for 11 years. "The room is paid for," Hugo said. "That's not what I'm talking about." "I know what you're talking about." Hugo set his hands on the counter. "The room is paid for, the documents are in order, and the road is closed with mud. I don't run a guild, Edmar. I run an inn." He kept his voice level, not angry. There was no use in anger. "You're welcome to stay for a drink if you like." Toss looked at him a moment longer, then turned and left without the drink. Hugo went back to the kitchen. He didn't hear her come down. He became aware of her standing in the kitchen doorway because the little one, Sibba, appeared at the edge of his vision first, peering around her mother's cloak. Hugo stirred the soup. The bone had given the broth a yellow tint, and the turnip was almost soft. Sibba's eyes followed the spoon. "I heard," the woman, Kryna, said. "We can go." "Where?" He said it without looking up. "The road's got half a foot of mud on it." He lifted the spoon, let the broth run off it. "Eat first." She didn't answer. He could feel her calculating something, the way a person does when they're trying to figure out the cost of accepting something, whether it was a debt or not, whether it changed anything. He'd seen that look before, on people who had been given reasons not to trust a handed thing. Sibba stepped into the kitchen. She watched him stir. He said nothing. She came closer, one small boot at a time, until she was standing beside the stove, looking up at him. "You can stir if you want," he said. He held the spoon out. She took it. She stirred with great seriousness, both hands on the handle, watching the turnip turn slow circles in the broth. Kryna said nothing. Hugo went to cut bread. Later he brought the tray up himself. 3 bowls, the bread, a little butter. He knocked. Leta opened the door. She'd taken her boots off, left them by the threshold with the laces loosened. She stepped back and he set the tray on the table by the window. The room was small but warm. The chimney from the kitchen ran through the back wall. He was almost to the door when he noticed the backpack. It was open on the floor, and he saw the patch on its side. 3 of them, actually, close together, where the same spot had been repaired over and over until the fabric was a different color. He kept walking. He went downstairs. He poured himself a cup from the kettle left on the low heat and stood in the kitchen, in the dark, listening to the silence of the inn around him. 8 rooms. 7 empty. Outside, the first frost of the season settled on the mud and locked it hard until morning. Some things don't announce themselves as choices. You just look down and you've already made them. The coachman's name was Seld, and he had already left. Hugo found this out at 7:30 in the morning, when Kryna came downstairs with her cloak on, and her daughters behind her, bags packed, ready to go, and told him, in a flat voice, that the man they had arranged transport with the day prior had sent word through the stable boy. He wasn't taking the northern route. Not with orcs. He'd returned half the fare and driven off before dawn. She said it without accusation. She said it the way a person recites a thing they've been expecting to hear for a long time. Hugo listened. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, the first of the morning, still too hot to drink properly. He set it down on the counter. "Wait here," he said. He took his coat from the hook by the door, the heavy one, oilcloth over wool, and went out. The street was cold. The mud from yesterday had frozen into ridges overnight, and his boots caught on them in the dark. He went to the stable yard first, then down to the southern end of the market square, where the freight drivers gathered in the early hours, then to a side street behind the mill, where a man named Kovac kept his cart and 2 horses, and a reputation for not asking unnecessary questions. Kovac was loading something when Hugo found him. He was 60, lean, with a gray beard cut close and a burn scar on his left forearm from some old accident he never explained. They talked for 7 minutes. Kovac quoted a price. Hugo said nothing for a moment. Then he negotiated it down by a fraction, because anything accepted without negotiation made Kovac suspicious. They settled. Hugo paid from his own pocket. The difference between what Kryna had already spent on the first driver and what Kovac asked. It wasn't a large sum. It wasn't small, either. He walked back. The frost had turned the puddles to pale disks of ice. When he came through the door, all 3 of them were still standing where he'd left them. The little one had put her bear figurine inside her collar so it wouldn't swing. Leta had her arms crossed, not with hostility, but the way you cross your arms when you're cold and you've been standing still. Kryna looked at him, then at the door, then at him again. "There's a driver," Hugo said. "He'll come at midday. Kovac, gray cart, 2 horses." He went to pick up his coffee. "He'll take the northern road." Kryna was quiet a moment. Then, "How much does he want?" "Same as the first one." She looked at him the way you look at a number that doesn't add up. She'd done the fare calculation herself the day before. He could tell by the way her jaw set. That's not what they charge for the North Road in autumn. "Kovac has his reasons." "His reasons or yours?" Hugo drank his coffee. It had gone lukewarm. "I'll pay you back," she said. It was not a question, and it was not gratitude. It was a statement of intention, and it had a quiet weight to it. "There's oat porridge on the stove," he said. "The girls can eat before the road." Sibba was already moving toward the kitchen. Leta followed her, then paused, looked back at her mother. Kryna gave a small nod. Both girls disappeared through the door. Hugo refilled his cup and stood at the window. Boar's Main Street was waking up. A man with a handcart, smoke from the bakery chimney, a dog crossing the road at a diagonal. Nothing moved fast this time of year. The town saved its energy, the way everything did when it got cold. He went upstairs for the first time that morning to check the other rooms. Habit. He kept them aired, even empty. When he passed the third door on the left, he heard nothing from inside. He went to the window at the end of the corridor and looked down into the yard. The frozen ground, the woodpile, the well with its rope stiff from cold. He went back down. When he came through the kitchen door, he stopped. Leta was at the basin. She had taken the breakfast bowls from the table, the ones the girls had used, and was washing them. Carefully, methodically, the way you wash something that doesn't belong to you. She had her sleeves rolled past the copper bracelet on her wrist. She didn't look at him when he came in. Sibba was sitting at the table with her porridge, watching her sister. Hugo stood in the doorway. He said nothing. He went to the stove, poured water into the second pot, put it on to heat. At midday, Kovac did not come. Hugo stood in the doorway and looked at the empty street. The frost had thawed by noon, and the mud was back, softer than before. No cart, no gray horses. He waited half an hour. He sent the stable boy to check. The boy came back. Kovac had gotten a better offer. A merchant going south who needed to move goods before the road closed entirely. He had left a message. He was sorry. Hugo came back inside. Kryna was in the hall. She had heard the stable boy's report. The walls in the inn were not thick. She looked at him without expression, but her hands were still on the strap of the backpack, holding it the way you hold something when you're preparing to lift it and keep going. "The road is mud," Hugo said. "There's no point in looking for another driver today." He said it simply, without softness and without apology. "The inspection of your documents was done yesterday. The room's been paid. The second night is—" He stopped. He started again. "There are 7 empty rooms in this building. One of them is yours." Kryna set the backpack down. Her jaw was tight. Sibba sat on the bottom step of the stairs and watched them both. "I don't take charity," Kryna said. "I know." "Then what are you offering?" Hugo looked at the hall. It was a large space, 4 tables, a long hearth, stone floor. In summer, he hired a girl to help him with the cleaning. In autumn, he did it himself, which meant he did some of it and left the rest. The floor needed scrubbing. The tables needed oiling. There were 3 months of small, neglected things in this room. "Work," he said, "for the room and the meals. What's left of today and tonight." She looked at him a moment. He could see her calculating it again. Not the money this time, but something harder to count. Then she said, "What needs doing?" He told her. He went upstairs to fix a stuck shutter on the end room. When he came back down 40 minutes later, the long hearth had been cleared of ash and swept. The floor around the first 2 tables was wet and clean, and Kryna was on her knees at the far end with a brush, working at the grout between the stones with a steadiness that said she'd done harder work than this. She didn't look up. He put a bucket of clean water beside her without comment and went into the kitchen where he found Leta standing at the prep table, silent, with a knife in her hand and a pile of onions. She had found them herself in the crate under the shelf and was already cutting. Some people don't wait to be told. That, too, is a kind of language. The second morning came gray and still. Hugo was up before the light, the way he always was. He built the kitchen fire from last night's coals, put water on, stood for a moment with his hands on the edge of the stove and let the warmth come into his palms. Outside the window, the sky was the color of pewter, and the yard was quiet. The mud had frozen again overnight. No cart would move well on that. He knew it before he checked. He checked anyway. He went upstairs. The third door on the left was closed, no sound from behind it. He went to the end of the corridor and looked out the window. Empty road. The well rope was stiff again. He stood there a moment, then went back down and made porridge. When Kraina came down, she was dressed and had her cloak on. The cloak told him everything. She had come prepared to negotiate or to leave, and the cloak was the thing you wore when you were ready to do either. "There's no driver," Hugo said before she could speak. "I know." She sat down at the nearest table, not the one by the window, the one with the best view of the door. He noticed that. He brought her a cup and filled it without asking. She looked at it, then at him. "We've been here 2 nights," she said. "Last night we worked for. The night before—" She stopped. "I want to settle it. The first night was paid. The difference—" Hugo pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't do this often, sit with guests. There was a reason for that. When you sat with people, you had to talk to them. "There's no difference," he said. "You got turned away by the coachman through no fault of yours. The room was available. It still is." "That's not how it works." Her voice was flat, without heat. This was not an argument about money. "I don't stay on someone else's account." "No one's keeping an account." "Then you should start." She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her fingers were long, calloused at the tips. "Because I am." He looked at her. The amber eyes were steady, and there was nothing soft in them. Not hostility, but a refusal to be managed. He understood it. He'd seen it in people who had learned the hard way that kindness usually came with a shape, and the shape was debt. "Then work for it," he said. She waited. "Same as yesterday. Room and meals in exchange for what needs doing. I've got a full list and not enough hours." He kept his voice even, not generous, transactional. He could see she needed it that way. "You'd be doing me the favor." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled in the kitchen. Upstairs, something small moved. Sibba, probably, awake and turning over. "What's on the list?" Kraina said. He told her. The storeroom shelves needed reordering. The second hearth in the common room hadn't been cleaned since September. 3 window shutters on the north side were warped from rain and needed planing to close properly. He'd do the planing himself, but someone needed to hold them steady. The linens from the corner rooms needed washing and drying before they went to storage. He recited it plainly, the way you read a list you've been putting off. She nodded once when he finished. "Later can do the linens," she said. "I'll start with the storeroom." That was it. No thank you, no protest. She finished the cup, stood up and said, "Where's the storeroom?" He showed her. He spent the morning on the shutters. It was cold work. The north side of the inn caught the wind and the warped wood was stubborn. He had the plane in his hands and the shutter braced against the frame, and he was concentrating on the angle when he heard the door to the storeroom open and close. He heard jars being moved, the sound of something being shifted on a shelf, then shifted again, more deliberately. Kraina worked quietly, but she worked with a thoroughness he could hear even through the wall. Leta appeared in the yard around mid-morning with an armful of linens and a look that said she had found the washtub herself without asking where it was. She sat up at the well and worked without speaking. She was 16 and angular, and she moved like someone who had been carrying their share of things for longer than 16 years usually required. The copper bracelet caught the pale light each time she lifted her arms. Syba stayed out of the way. This was, Hugo noticed, deliberate. She was not a child who faded naturally. She was bright-eyed and watchful and clearly had opinions about everything she saw. But she had read the room, or her mother had told her, and she kept herself small. She sat in the corner of the common room with the wooden bear at her neck and watched the door. Hugo came in from the shutters at midday to find the storeroom door open and Kryna on her knees on the floor. She had pulled everything off the lower shelves, every jar, every wrapped parcel, every tin, and sorted it into two groups. One group was back on the shelf, in a precise order he didn't recognize, but suspected made more sense than his own. The other group was on the floor beside her. He looked at it. "What's this?" "Spoiling," she said. She didn't look up. She was checking the seal on a jar of preserved pears, pressing her thumb against the wax edge. Jars with broken seals, dried goods with mildew, one sack that's been wet and dried again at least twice. She set the jar on the floor pile. "You'd have gotten sick on some of it by midwinter." He looked at the floor pile. 6 jars, 2 cloth parcels, the sack. He'd bought most of it in September, put it on the shelf, and not looked carefully since. He crouched down and picked up one of the parcels. Dried mushrooms, the paper wrapping spotted with gray at one corner. He hadn't noticed. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him then, not with warmth, but with something that wasn't suspicion either, just attention. She nodded once and went back to the shelf. In the evening he made stew, the good stock he kept in the cellar, with the last of the autumn root vegetables and a handful of barley. He brought it out in a pot and left it on the long table with a ladle and 3 bowls. Then he went back for a 4th and sat down. Kryna looked at the 4th bowl. "I'm eating anyway," Hugo said. He served himself. She served Syba first, then Leta, then herself. Syba immediately blew on her bowl with great concentration, making small wind sounds. Leta ate without speaking, but she ate a second helping, and she did it without looking to her mother for permission first. Hugo ate and said nothing. The fire in the hearth was good, steady, low, the kind that heats a room without roaring. After a while, Syba said, "Why is there a bear on the shelf?" Hugo looked up. On the shelf above the second hearth, the decorative one, the mantel, there was a small, wooden horse. Not a bear. Syba was looking at it with great interest. "That's a horse," Leta said. "I know what a horse is." Syba's tone made clear that she found this response unhelpful. Hugo looked at the horse. He hadn't moved it in 2 years. He'd stopped seeing it some time before that. "Someone made it," he said. Syba waited for more. He didn't give it. She went back to her stew, but she kept looking at the shelf from the corner of her eye. The way children look at things they've decided they're not done thinking about. Kryna said nothing. She watched him for a moment, just a moment, then looked down at her bowl. Outside, the wind came up and hit the north shutters. The planed ones held. The third one, the one he hadn't finished, rattled once and went quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and stopped. The stew pot steamed between them, and the fire kept its low, even breath. And for a while, nobody needed to say anything at all. There are small truces that don't have names. You just find yourself inside one, and you don't move, because moving might end it. The mayor came at 10 in the morning, which was deliberate. Hugo knew it was deliberate because the mayor, a man named Rorst, with a careful gray beard and the posture of someone who had spent 20 years making comfort look like authority, never came to the Gray Stone at 10 in the morning. He came in the evenings occasionally, for a drink he nursed slowly and a conversation he controlled. 10 in the morning meant he had thought about this. It meant he had decided on the hour the way you decide on a weapon. He came alone, which was also deliberate. Hugo was behind the counter when the door opened. He had the ledger out, not because he needed it, but because having something in your hands made certain conversations easier to end. Rohrst came in, looked around the hall once, and then looked at Hugo with the expression of a man who considered himself reasonable. "Hugo," he set his hat on the counter. A good hat, felted gray, with a small brass pin on the band. "You know why I'm here." "I can guess," Hugo said. "The town has concerns." Rohrst folded his hands. He had the voice of a man who had given many speeches, round, unhurried, pleasant in the way that things are pleasant when they cost nothing. "Orcs in the inn. The border road brings all kinds, I understand that. But there are families here. There are children." "There are children upstairs," Hugo said. Rohrst paused. He recalibrated. "Hugo, I'm not asking you to do anything unkind. I'm asking you to consider the community." He said community the way some men said family, as if it explained everything and required nothing in return. "Perhaps they would be more comfortable at the way station outside town. It's not far." "The way station is unheated, and the roof leaks on the east side." Hugo closed the ledger. "Their documents are in order. Their money was good. The road is mud." He kept his hands on the counter, flat. "The rules at my place are written above the door. You've seen them." Rohrst had seen them. The sign above the door of the Greystone read, in letters carved when Hugo's father had owned the place, "Inn." One word. His father had been a man of strong opinions about unnecessary ornamentation. "It says inn," Hugo said. "I know what it says." Rohrst's pleasantness thinned, just slightly, the way a coat wears through at the elbow. "I'm asking you to consider the situation carefully. There will be an inspection of the premises. Routine. You understand these things happen." He picked up his hat. "It would be a difficult time for violations to come to light." He said it without threat in his voice. That was the careful part. He left, and the door dragged at the bottom corner as it closed. Hugo stood at the counter for a moment. Then he went upstairs to fix the third shutter. He was on the landing with the plane in his hand when he heard Sibba. She was in the corridor, not far from the door of their room, and she had found the shelf above the landing window, a low shelf, child height, that held 3 things: a tin candle holder, a coil of spare rope, and the wooden horse. He didn't know when he'd put the horse there. He'd moved it at some point from the mantel, because looking at it had become a specific kind of effort, and the landing shelf was a place he passed quickly. Sibba was holding the horse in both hands. She had it level with her eyes and was examining it with great seriousness. The carving was not fine work. The legs were thick, the ears barely suggested, the tail a single groove in the wood. But it had been made by someone who knew what a horse was and had cared about getting it right. Hugo stood on the landing and looked at it. She heard him and looked up. She didn't put it back. She waited. "Someone made it," he said. He'd said that before. He knew it wasn't enough. Sibba kept looking at him. She had her mother's steadiness in the eyes, that amber directness that didn't flinch. She was 8 years old, and she was waiting for the actual answer. "My son," Hugo said. "He made it." He didn't say more. He didn't say the rest of it. The 6 years, The absence that had made 7 empty rooms feel like a reasonable arrangement, the way the kitchen was still warm every morning because he needed one thing in the house to be warm without him having to decide it. He didn't say any of that. He just stood on the landing with the plane in his hand and looked at a horse carved by a boy who had been 11 when he made it, and who had not lived to be 12. Sibba held the horse out. She was offering it back. He looked at her hands, the bright green skin, the wooden bear at her neck swinging forward as she leaned. "You can play with it," he said. She pulled it back to her chest. She looked at it once more, then up at him. Then she turned and went into the room and closed the door behind her. Hugo went and planed the shutter. In the evening he came down late after the kitchen was clean. He was going to sit for a while the way he usually did, in the chair by the cold second hearth, in the dark, with nothing particular to do. He found a cup of tea on the small table beside the chair. It was still warm. There was no one in the room. He could hear, faintly, the sound of the girls upstairs, some quiet conversation, the creak of a floorboard. He stood and looked at the cup. He sat down. He picked it up. The tea was plain, hot water and dried leaves from the kitchen stores, nothing he hadn't bought himself, but someone had known where to look for it, and someone had taken the trouble to steep it, and someone had thought to bring it here and leave it. He drank it. Outside the window the mud street was empty, and the cold pressed against the glass, and the inn around him held its breath the way old stone buildings do in winter. All that mass, all that stillness, keeping the warmth in without effort, without asking anything back. There are things you didn't know you were missing until they appear on a table beside you, already warm. The third morning had a different quality to it. Hugo noticed it the way you notice a change in the air before weather. Not a sound or a sight, but something in the pressure of things. The inn was the same. The frost was the same. He built the fire the same way, from the same coals, and stood at the stove the same number of minutes while the water heated. But when Kryna came down, she didn't have her cloak on. She sat at the table by the window, not the one by the door. He brought coffee. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked out at the yard, at the frost on the well rope, at the pale sky above the roofline. She didn't say anything for a while. He went back to the kitchen and turned the bread in the pan and came out again. "We're going to my sister," she said, "in Veln." He didn't know where Veln was. He didn't ask immediately. He leaned against the counter and let her talk if she wanted to. "She has a house there. Small, but a house." Kryna turned the cup in her hands. "Her husband died 2 years ago. Mine 3. She said it the same way she said most things, flat, factual, the information delivered without decoration. "She wrote that there's work in Veln, weaving mostly. I know the work." She paused. "Leta's quick with her hands. She'll learn." Hugo looked at the window. Veln was north, he knew that much. 2 days by cart on a good road. 4 on this one, in this season. "Why now?" he said. "Why not wait for spring?" "Because if we wait for spring, we wait in a place that doesn't have room for us." She said it without self-pity. It was just geography. "My sister has a house. Here we have—" She stopped. She looked at the table. "Here we have been longer than we planned." He nodded. He went to the kitchen and came back with the bread and butter and set it on the table. She pulled a piece without ceremony. He sat down across from her, which he was doing more easily now than he had 3 days ago. They ate. Outside, a cart went past on the frozen street, moving slowly, the horse stepping carefully on the ridged mud. "You have family here?" Kryna asked. He looked at his cup. "No." She waited, the way she'd waited on the landing when Sibba had waited, with that same amber patience that didn't push, but didn't retreat either. "My wife left," he said. "After." He didn't say after what. He found he didn't need to. "Said she couldn't stay in a place that only reminded her. I understood it." He turned his cup once on the table. "I couldn't leave. Didn't know how to be somewhere else." He looked up. "The inn was my father's. I know how to run it. So, I run it." Kryna looked at him steadily. She didn't offer anything, no comfort, no comparison, no attempt to weigh her loss against his. He was grateful for that. Most people, when you told them something hard, felt compelled to give something back. She just listened. "My son," Hugo said. He was 11. 6 years. He had not said it aloud to anyone in this town. He had said it to the ledger once, in numbers. The date, the expense of the burial, the gap in the accounts where he'd closed the inn for 2 weeks and told no one why. He had said it to the empty rooms, the way you speak to walls when speaking to walls is the only option left. He had not said it to a person. Not like this. Not in one sentence, plainly, across a table. Kryna set her cup down. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "The red streak." She touched her own hair above the brow where the thick red ran through the black. "My mother had it. Her mother before her. It passes through the women." She looked toward the stairs. "Leta has it. Sibba has it. When I see it, I see 4 generations at once." She paused. "That's not always easy." Hugo looked at her. He understood what she was giving him. Not a mirror, not a comparison, but a parallel thing. Evidence that this kind of weight was common to people who carried it well, and that carrying it well didn't mean it was light. He heard Leta on the stairs before he saw her. Her step was distinctive, the left boot coming down slightly heavier than the right, a small unevenness she didn't seem aware of. She appeared in the doorway, looked at the two of them at the table, and went to the shelves along the far wall without comment. Hugo kept a small collection of books there, a habit from his father, who had believed that a good inn should have books the way it had a fire, available to anyone who needed warmth. Leta ran her finger along the spines. She pulled one out, a thick volume, brown cloth cover, the spine faded. She looked at the title, then at Hugo. "Can I?" she said. "Yes," he said. She tucked it under her arm. Then, without quite looking at him, "There are more." She said it as an observation, not a question, as if she was noting it for future reference. As if future reference was a thing she was beginning to allow herself. He said, "There are more." She went upstairs. Kryna watched her go, and something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just the way a held breath releases, a small easing around the eyes. Hugo saw it. He looked away, giving her the privacy of it. He refilled both cups. It was mid-afternoon when the letter came. The boy from the postal office brought it to the door. A square envelope with the town office stamp, sealed with gray wax. Hugo opened it at the counter. It was brief. 3 days hence, an inspection of the premises. Licensing, fire safety, guest registry. Standard procedure, the letter said, in the careful handwriting of someone who had been told to make it sound routine. Hugo read it twice. He folded it and put it in his apron pocket. He stood at the counter and looked at the hall, the clean floor, the oiled tables, the swept hearths. He thought about the guest registry, which had 3 names in it that were not human names, and the licensing board, which was chaired by a man who ate dinner twice a week at Edmar Toss's inn. He thought about Rorst's careful voice. Difficult time for violations to come to light. He put his hand flat on the counter. The stone was cold under his palm, the deep cold of old building material, the kind that holds winter in its bones long after the rooms above it are warm. He breathed out slowly. 3 days. He had 3 days and a list of everything in the inn that wasn't quite right, and a letter in his pocket that was not a routine inspection dressed as a threat, but a threat dressed as a routine inspection. He went to find Kryna. Hugo started with the registry. He pulled it from under the counter and went through it page by page at the kitchen table, with the letter beside it and a pencil in his hand. Every entry needed a date, a document number, a point of origin. His handwriting was adequate but careless. He'd been filling the registry the way he did most things these days, mechanically, getting the information down without attention to presentation. 3 entries were missing document reference numbers. 1 had the date written in the wrong column. He corrected them carefully, going back to the original documents he kept in the lockbox under the stairs and cross-referencing each one. He worked slowly and got it right. Then he walked the building. He went room by room, the way he hadn't done in months. The fire exits, clear. The window latches, 2 stiff, one on the upper floor, missing its pin entirely, replaced at some point with a twist of wire he had no memory of installing. He replaced the wire with a proper pin from the box in the workshop. The hearth in the common room had a crack along the back wall of the firebox. Not dangerous, but visible. And visible things invited questions. He mixed mortar and filled it and smoothed it flat. He checked the lamp brackets, the stair rail, the cellar door latch. It took most of the morning. He came back to the common room to find it changed. Not dramatically. Nothing moved, nothing rearranged. But the tables had been wiped down with something that left them smelling of the herb water Kryna had made 2 days ago from sprigs out of his own dry store. The floor along the far wall, which he had missed in his sweep, was clean. The second hearth, the one that served as decoration more than heat, had been cleared of the ash he'd let accumulate since September and swept to bare stone. Kryna was not in the room. He could hear her in the storeroom. He stood in the middle of the hall and looked at it. He had not asked her to do this. He had not asked her to do any of it. She had walked into a problem that was his problem, that had become partly her problem through no fault of her own, and she had started working on it with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, and she had done it without making it a conversation. He went to the storeroom doorway. She was on her knees again, this time at the back shelves, checking the condition of the clay-sealed crocks he used for long storage. She had a rag in one hand and was wiping condensation from the lids. She didn't look up, but she knew he was there. He said he was going to check the upstairs rooms. She said the shutter latch on the room at the end of the corridor was loose. She'd noticed it that morning. He said he'd look at it. He went upstairs. Leta was in the corridor with a cloth and a bucket. She was doing the baseboards, the long wooden strips at the floor's edge that caught dust and went ignored for seasons at a time. She worked from the far end toward the stairs, unhurried, with the focused quality she brought to everything physical. She didn't acknowledge him. He stepped around her and went to the end room and looked at the shutter latch. It was loose. The screws had worked out of old wood that had expanded and contracted too many times. He went downstairs for the right screws and came back and fixed it. Sibba was in the room they'd been using. He could see her through the open door as he passed. She was sitting on the bed with the wooden horse in her hands, and the book Leta had taken from the shelf open on the blanket beside her. She wasn't reading it. She was turning the horse over slowly, looking at its underside, the way children examine things they are trying to understand completely. He kept walking. He spent the afternoon on the front face of the building. The 2 lamps that flanked the door needed new oil, and one had a crack in the glass he'd covered with a strip of lead some months back. He replaced the glass. He filled both lamps. He swept the step and the narrow strip of stone in front of the door, where mud had dried and flaked. He stood back and looked at the front of the inn. It looked like a place someone was keeping. That was the goal. He was back inside and at the counter when he heard the knock. Not the door knock, the counter knock. A flat, official double tap that people learned in offices and never stopped using. He looked up. The man in the doorway was not Rohrst. He was younger, with a leather satchel and a coat that belonged to the town administration, the dark green with the brass buttons that the inspection officers wore. He had a ledger under his arm and the look of someone who had been sent to do a job and intended to do it thoroughly. He was a day early. Hugo set his hands on the counter. He kept his face neutral. He said good afternoon. The inspector came in and looked around the hall with the specific look of a man cataloging rather than observing. He opened his ledger. He said he was here on behalf of the town licensing office for a routine inspection of the premises and guest registry. He said it precisely, without inflection. Hugo said he understood and pulled out the registry. The inspector read through it. He read slowly, checking each entry against something in his own ledger. He asked about the document numbers. Hugo had them. He asked about the fire exit on the north side. Hugo showed him. They walked the lower floor, the hall, the kitchen, the storeroom, the cellar door. The inspector wrote things down. His pen moved in small, economical strokes. They came back to the counter. The inspector looked at the guest registry again. He looked at the 3 names that were not human names. He asked to see the corresponding documents. Hugo took the lockbox from under the stairs and opened it and laid the documents on the counter. Border transit papers, sealed and stamped, with the office reference numbers printed clearly at the top. Everything Kreina had put on the counter 3 days ago when she'd first walked in. Original documents, not copies, in good condition. The inspector looked at them. He wrote something in his ledger. Then there was a sound on the stairs. Kreina came down first, with the deliberate step of someone who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. She had her documents in her hand. She had brought them herself, without being called, without being asked. She crossed the hall and set them on the counter beside the others. She stood straight and said nothing, and looked at the inspector with the amber eyes that did not flinch at anything. Behind her came Sibba. She had the wooden horse in one hand. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom of the stairs and looked at the inspector with the round-faced directness of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't watching. The wooden horse hung in her grip at her side. The inspector looked at Sibba. Sibba looked at the inspector. The inspector looked at the documents. He checked the reference numbers. He checked them again. He wrote in his ledger for a long moment, the pen moving in those small strokes, and the hall was very quiet, except for the fire and the scratch of the pen and the wind outside finding the eaves. He closed the ledger. He said the documents were in order. He said the premises appeared to meet the required standard. He gathered his papers, put them in the satchel, and closed the brass clasp. He nodded at Hugo, not at Kreina, not at Sibba, and went to the door and left. Hugo stood at the counter. He heard the door drag at the bottom corner and close. He turned around. Kreina was still at the counter. Sibba was still on the stair. Behind them both, Leta had appeared from the kitchen doorway. She had come down at some point during the inspection and stationed herself there without anyone noticing. She had a dish towel in her hands, which she was not using as a dish towel. Hugo looked at the 3 of them in the hall of his inn. He looked at the clean floor and the filled lamps and the corrected registry and the documents spread on the counter, all in order, all exactly what they needed to be. He said dinner would be in an hour. He went to the kitchen. Behind him he heard Sibba come down the last 2 steps, and the quiet sound of the wooden horse knocking gently against the banister as she went. The inspection had come a day early. Everything had been ready anyway. That was not luck. That was 4 people who had each, separately, decided that this place was worth keeping. Hugo slept well for the first time in weeks. He didn't notice it until he woke. The quality of the silence, the fact that his body had settled rather than held itself tense through the night. He lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The plaster had a crack running from the window corner toward the center, a crack he had been meaning to fill for 2 years. He looked at it without the usual accompanying thought about getting around to it. Then he got up and built the fire. The morning moved the way mornings did when something had resolved. Not loudly, just with less friction. The water heated at the same speed, the bread went in the pan the same way, but he stood at the stove with his hands loose at his sides instead of gripped on the edge of it. He had expected at some point in the night to feel the residue of the inspection, some lingering tension, some waiting for the second consequence. It hadn't come. The inspector had found nothing because there was nothing to find. That was the whole of it. He turned the bread and thought about what needed doing today with the straightforward attention of a man who had gotten through the thing he was worried about and come out the other side with his footing intact. Kraina came down without her cloak again. He had started to notice the cloak as a signal. On meant ready to leave or ready to fight. Off meant something closer to settled. She sat at the window table and looked out at the yard while he poured coffee, and they were quiet together in the way that had become, over 4 days, its own kind of conversation. He put bread on the table. She pulled a piece. He sat down. He told her about the inspector. Not what she hadn't seen. She'd been there for the whole of it. But what he'd heard afterward from the stable boy who had a cousin in the town office. The inspection had been filed as routine. No violations noted. No follow-up required. The licensing board had received the report that morning. Rohrst had received it too, presumably, through whatever channel Rohrst received things. Kraina listened to this and said nothing for a moment. Then she said the documents had cost her 3 weeks of work to obtain when they first crossed the border. 3 weeks of presenting herself at offices and waiting, and being sent to other offices and waiting again, with 2 daughters and a backpack, and a route that didn't allow for much delay. She said it without bitterness, just the dry weight of a fact that had been expensive to produce and had now justified its cost. Hugo looked at his coffee. He understood what she was telling him. She had known, all along, that the documents would hold. She had been certain of them. The uncertainty had been about whether certainty would be enough. They ate. Upstairs, the floorboards moved in a pattern he was learning. Sibba first, quick and light. Then Leta, the uneven left step. Then the long pause before either of them came down, which he now understood was the time Kraina normally spent with them in the morning before the day started. He cleared the table and went to the kitchen. Leta appeared an hour later. She came in without announcing herself and stood at the prep table and looked at what was on it. He had flour out, and the rendered fat from yesterday, and the dried herbs. He was making flat traveler's bread, the kind that kept for days and didn't need anything else. She looked at the ingredients for a moment, then went to the shelf where he kept the grain stores and came back with a small cloth pouch he didn't recognize. She'd brought it herself, carried it in the backpack from wherever they'd started. She opened it, and he looked inside. A coarse, dark flour, ground from something that wasn't wheat, with a faint smell of minerals and smoke. She didn't explain it. She measured some into the bowl alongside his flour and began to work it in with her hands. And he understood she was making something her own way, with her own ingredient, in his kitchen, and that this was not a question. He stepped to the side and gave her the bowl. They worked at the same table without speaking. She had a competence with dough that was physical and confident. She knew the texture she was aiming for and adjusted the water without measuring, by feel. He watched her hands from the corner of his eye. The copper bracelet pushed up her wrist as she worked. At some point she began to shape the flatbreads, smaller than his, thicker in the center, with a pinched edge he didn't recognize. He put them in the pan when she was done. She stood back and watched. When he ate one, he said it was different from what he made. He said it was good. She looked at the pan and not at him, but her hands, which had been still at her sides, relaxed. He put more on to cook. In the afternoon, the light came low and thin through the south windows, the pale autumn light that didn't warm anything but lit it clearly. Sibba was at the table in the common room with a sheet of paper she had found somewhere and a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth, drawing something with great concentration. Hugo passed through and looked at the paper. She had drawn the inn, a square building with 2 rows of windows and a door in the middle, recognizable if not precise. In the doorway she had drawn a figure in an apron. He kept walking. He found Kryna in the corridor upstairs, at the window at the end. She was mending. She'd been mending by candlelight the past 2 evenings, working through a pile of clothing from the backpack that needed attention. She had the needle and thread going in the gray afternoon light, and she was doing it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, the same unhurried exactness. He almost walked past. Then he stopped and said there was thread in the drawer on the left, the small dresser at the end of the corridor, which had sat there since his father's time. She looked up. He opened the drawer and showed her. 6 spools of various weights, a spare needle card, a small pair of scissors with worn handles. She looked at the drawer for a moment, and he could see her noting it, not thanking him, noting it, filing it in the place where she kept useful information. She chose a spool of heavier thread and held it to the fabric she was mending. It matched close enough. He left her to it. At dinner, the table had 5 things on it that hadn't been there in the morning. The flatbreads Leta had made, a small pot of something dark and sharp-smelling that Kryna had put together from her own stores and the kitchen's dried goods, the bread he'd made, the butter, and Sibba's drawing, which she had placed in the center of the table like a document. Nobody commented on the drawing. Nobody moved it. They ate around it. The fire held its low breath. The inn was quiet outside their table. Hugo ate the dark, sharp thing Kryna had made, and didn't ask what was in it, and she didn't tell him, and it was good. Leta ate 2 flatbreads. Sibba ate methodically, with one eye on the drawing to make sure it was still there. Afterwards, Hugo sat alone in the hall and listened to them go upstairs. The left boot, the light quick step, the pause at the landing. 3 people moving through a building that had held only one person's weight for a long time. The stairs took it without complaint. Old stone absorbed things quietly, without making a ceremony of it. That was what stone was for. Tomorrow there would be another coachman to find. The road north was not getting easier. But tonight the lamps were full, and the floor was clean, and something was mending somewhere in the building by the light that came through the corridor window at the end of the hall. The coachman's name was Dara, and she was found by accident. Hugo heard about her from the baker 2 streets over, who had heard from the miller's wife, who had seen a freight cart from Veln come in the previous afternoon and stop at the southern stable. The driver had unloaded grain sacks and was looking for a return fare north. Hugo went to the southern stable before breakfast. Dara was a woman of about 50 with a broad back and a cart that had seen hard use and been well maintained, the axles greased, the boards tight, the horse fed and rested. They talked for 10 minutes. She asked no questions about the passengers beyond their number and their baggage weight. She named a fair price. Hugo said the day after tomorrow. She said she'd be there at first light. He came back and told Kryna over coffee, and he watched something in her shoulders settle. Not dramatically, just a fraction. The way a load shifts when you adjust your grip. 2 days. That was a real number now, not a waiting. He went to cook. He was at the stove with his back to the kitchen door when he heard Leta come in. He'd learned her sounds well enough by now to know it was her without looking. The particular rhythm of her step, the way she moved into a room with intention rather than drift. He heard her at the shelf, then at the prep table. He didn't turn around. She worked alongside him for a while in silence, and he let the silence be. She had the dark flour out again, and her own pouch of something else. Dried seeds, small and flat, that she scattered into the dough with a practiced hand. He kept his attention on the stock pot and didn't crowd her at the table. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window the frost was heavy on the yard, the well rope white with it, the ground iron hard. When she put the first flatbread in the second pan, he moved to give her the better position at the stove. She took it without comment. He stepped to the side and began to portion the stock for the midday soup. They worked around each other with the efficiency of people who have learned each other's reach. He tried one when it came off the pan. The seeds had toasted in the fat, and the bread had a depth to it, something mineral and faintly bitter underneath the char, a flavor he had no reference for. He stood at the stove and chewed it and thought about it honestly. He said it was different from what he made. He said it was good. She was already putting the next one in the pan, but her hands slowed for just a moment, and then she continued. He put a stack of them on the board for midday and set the board on the table. The morning moved. He oiled the counter, which had been on the list for a week. He wrote 3 letters he'd been putting off, to a supplier in the south about spring stock, to the licensing office acknowledging receipt of the inspection report, to a man in the next town who owed him money and had been forgetting about it with impressive consistency. He wrote them at the counter with the inn quiet around him, and when he was done, he set them to one side and looked at the hall. Kryna appeared from the back corridor with her mending in her hands. She settled at the table nearest the second hearth, the one with the best light in the afternoon, and worked without speaking. He watched her from the counter without staring. The needle moved steadily through dark fabric, and he could see now what she was mending. A shirt of Leta's, the sleeve seam opened from heavy use, being re-sewn with the heavier thread from the corridor drawer. She had her own thimble, a small brass one, worn smooth on the outside, that she kept on the first joint of her right middle finger. He passed by the table once in the early afternoon, on his way to the storeroom. On his return, he stopped and told her there was more thread in the drawer if she needed a different weight. She looked up briefly. She said the weight was right. He continued to the counter. Siva spent the morning on the floor of the common room with the wooden horse and a collection of small objects she had sourced from somewhere. 3 acorns, a flat stone, a bent piece of copper wire. She had arranged them in a pattern that was either a camp or a town or both, and the horse stood in the center of it. She was narrating something under her breath, too quiet to make out. Hugo went around her when he needed to cross the room. She didn't look up. In the afternoon, he found Leta at the bookshelf. She had the plant book open on the table, the one she'd taken 4 days ago, and beside it she had opened a second one, a narrower volume about the Northern Territories that his father had bought from a traveling seller and never read. She was going between the two, reading something in the plant book and checking it against the territory maps. Hugo stood at the end of the table and looked at what she was doing. She had found an entry about a plant that grew in the north, and she was locating it on the territory map with one finger. She didn't look up, but she was aware of him. She turned the plant book slightly so he could see the page without asking. He sat down. He looked at what she was reading. A dense entry about a shrubby plant with dark berries that grew above the frost line, used in the north for preserving meat. He looked at the map, at the region around Veln. He said there was a third book, older than the other 2, with a more detailed account of the northern plants. His father had annotated it in the margins. He got up and found it on the upper shelf, behind a row of ledgers where it had been sitting undisturbed for years. He put it on the table. She opened it. The margins were full of his father's handwriting, Small, angular notes about what grew where, and what it tasted like, and what it was good for. She read for a while. He stayed at the table. They talked for an hour, or close to it. Not continuously. There were long stretches of quiet between things, where she read and he looked at the map and they existed in the same space without needing to fill it. But she asked questions when she had them, plainly and without preamble, and he answered what he knew and said clearly when he didn't know. She had a precise mind. She asked about things he hadn't thought about in years, the specific properties of certain soils, the way frost affected root depth, the difference between the plants that grew on the border and the ones that grew further north. He dug up answers from the back of his memory and was surprised, occasionally, to find them there. At some point, he became aware that Krina was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had put her mending down. She was looking at the table, at her daughter, open-backed over 3 books, and at Hugo across from her, with the old ledger open in his hands. Krina stood in the doorway and looked at this for a moment. Hugo noticed her and held the quiet. Leta kept reading. Something in Krina's face did what it had done briefly when Leta had taken the bread from the shelf on the first morning. That small release, the easing of something held. It lasted only a moment. She went back to the table and picked up her mending. In the evening, the flatbreads were on the table alongside the soup and the bread, and Siva had moved her camp to the windowsill where it caught the last light. The horse stood at the edge of the sill, looking out at the dark yard. The inn smelled of toasted seeds and broth, and the particular cold and wood smell it had when the temperature dropped outside and the walls held the warmth in. Hugo looked at the table. The 2 kinds of bread, the shared pot, the mismatched cups. 4 days ago he had set 1 cup on this table. The habit of 1 cup was 6 years old, and he had not questioned it in all that time. The way you stop questioning the shape of things that have become the shape of your life. He didn't question it now, either. He just filled 4 cups and sat down. Some things change the way daylight changes. So gradually you can't point to the moment it happened, only to the difference between what it was and what it is now. The last full day arrived without announcing itself. Hugo knew it was the last full day because Dara's cart was coming at first light tomorrow, and first light in late autumn came early and cold and didn't wait. He built the fire the same way he always did, from the same coals, and stood at the stove the same number of minutes. But he was aware, underneath the routine, of a kind of counting. The last breakfast, the last midday, the last evening with 4 cups on the table instead of 1. He didn't dwell on it. He made porridge and cut bread and put water on for coffee and went about the morning the way mornings required. Leta came down first. She had the plant book under her arm, the old one, his father's, with the margin notes. She set it on the counter and looked at Hugo. He told her to keep it. She looked at the book, then at the shelf it had come from, then back at Hugo. She put it into the large backpack that was already sitting packed at the foot of the stairs. He didn't watch her do it. He turned back to the stove. They spent the morning with the books. He brought out the 3rd volume, the one about Northern Territories, and they laid all 3 open on the long table and went through the region around Veln with the attention of people making a practical study. He showed her what he knew about the frost line, how it shifted in the valleys, where the ground stayed workable longest. She asked about the dark buried shrub from the day before, whether it would grow near the town or only on the higher slopes. He said he thought both, depending on the drainage. She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything, and wrote something on a scrap of paper with the charcoal Siva had left on the table. Krina sat at the window table with her coffee and watched them. She had her hands around the cup, and she was not pretending to look at something else. She watched her daughter at the table with the books, writing notes in her angular hand, asking questions and receiving answers and asking more. Hugo was aware of being watched. He didn't perform for it. He just answered the questions that were asked. After a while, Krena got up and came to the table. She didn't sit. She stood at the end and looked at the map, at the region marked Veln, at the pencil line Leta had drawn, showing the route from the border crossing. She put her finger on the town marker. She said her sister's house was on the east side, near the mill. Hugo looked at the map. He said the east side would have good soil. The river ran close there, and river soil in the north held warmth longer than the slopes. Krena looked at the map for another moment, her finger still on the town marker. Then she went back to the window. Sibba appeared mid-morning from upstairs, where she had been doing something that involved periodic thumping sounds he had decided not to investigate. She came down with her jacket buttoned, all the buttons, which was unusual, and the wooden bear at her neck, and the wooden horse in her hand. She crossed the common room and stood in front of Hugo at the table. She held the horse out, both hands level, the way she'd held it on the landing when she'd thought she was returning it. He looked at it. The thick legs, the suggested ears, the single groove of a tail. 11 years old and taking care with the thing he was making. He said she should keep it. She looked at the horse. She looked at him. Then she pulled it back to her chest, carefully, and held it there for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something you've decided is yours. She went to the window and stood beside her mother, and looked out at the frozen yard. Hugo looked at the table. He straightened the edge of the map and didn't say anything else. The afternoon came and went with the particular patience of last days. He checked the cart shed for anything Dara might need to know about the yard access. He put fresh oil in both door lamps. He went through the kitchen stores and thought about the road to Velm. 2 days minimum, the cart stopping overnight at the way station outside the border town, which was unheated and had a leaking roof on the east side, which he'd mentioned to no one but was thinking about now. He went to the kitchen and started cooking. He made more than was needed for one evening. He made a double portion of the dense traveler's bread, the kind that kept. He made a pot of the preserved meat from the cellar store, cooked down with root vegetables until it was thick enough to eat cold. He filled 3 of the small clay crocks from the cleaned storeroom shelf and sealed them with the wax he kept in the workshop drawer. He wrapped the flatbreads, Leta's kind, which he had made himself this time, with the dark flour she'd left in a cloth pouch on the shelf, in clean linen. He did all of this without making it a discussion. At dinner, the table held more food than usual, and nobody commented on the quantity. Sibba ate with the horse standing on the table beside her bowl, which Krena allowed without remark. Leta had the scrap of paper with her notes, folded in her shirt pocket. Hugo poured the coffee, and they ate in the firelight with the inn quiet around them, and the frost building outside on the yard stone. Afterward, Krena put coins on the table. She set them down deliberately in a small stack, and Hugo looked at them. He looked at the number. It was more than they had agreed. More than the rooms, more than the meals, more than the work exchanged. He could see she had calculated something larger. He sat with it for a moment. Then he took half the stack and left the rest on the table. She looked at what remained. He told her it was for the rooms. She looked at him steadily. He could see her working through the accounting. The first night, the second, the work exchanged for the third and fourth, what was owed against what had been given. She was trying to make it balance. He understood the need. He didn't argue with the need. But he left half the coins on the table, and he didn't move them back. She picked up her half. She put it in the pouch at her belt. She said nothing more about it. Leta washed the bowls. Sibba fell asleep in the chair by the hearth before anyone told her to go to bed, the horse in her hand and the bear at her neck, and her jacket still buttoned all the way up. Krena carried her upstairs. Hugo heard the creak of the landing, the uneven step of Leta following. The building settled into its nighttime quiet, that particular stillness of old stone after warmth, when the walls have absorbed the day's heat and hold it without effort. He stayed at the table for a while after they went up. He looked at the shelf above the second hearth, where the horse had stood for 2 years without him seeing it. The shelf was empty now. He looked at it without the specific weight he'd carried around it for 6 years. Not without grief, but without the kind of grief that stops things. Just the plain fact of it, sitting alongside the plain fact of the empty shelf, and neither one demanding anything from him. He cleared the table. He put the sealed crocks by the door, where they'd be ready for the morning. He checked the fire in the kitchen hearth and banked it for the night. He went to the door and stood for a moment, looking at the dark yard through the small window beside it. Frost on the stones. The road beyond the gate, empty, running north. He went to bed. For the second night in a row, he slept without holding himself tense through it. There are things that don't ask permission to start healing. They just begin, quietly, while you're doing something else entirely. Dara's cart was in the yard before the sky was fully light. Hugo heard the horse first, the particular sound of shod hooves on frozen stone, careful and deliberate in the dark. He was already up. He had been up for an hour, building the fire, boiling water, moving through the kitchen with the quiet attention of someone who knows a morning is going to require something from him and wants to be ready for it. The coffee was made. The bundle by the door was tied. The sealed crocks, the wrapped flatbreads, a length of wool from the upstairs linen store he'd added last night without quite deciding to, thick enough to serve as a blanket on a cold cart. He heard them on the stairs. The quick, light step, the uneven left boot, and then Kryna, whose step he knew now the way he knew the building's own sounds, solid, deliberate, carrying weight without complaint. They came into the kitchen one at a time. Sibba had the horse in her jacket pocket, the carved head sticking out at the collar. Leta had the backpack, the big one with the brass clasps, which she set by the door beside the bundle without being asked. Kryna looked at the bundle. She looked at the crocks and the wrapped linen and the wool. She didn't say anything about it. Hugo poured coffee and set bread on the table. They ate, standing, mostly, the way people eat when they are already in motion toward something. Sibba sat on the edge of the table, which Hugo allowed. The kitchen was warm, and the yard outside the window was still gray. Dara's cart a dark shape against the gate, the horse standing patient with its breath clouding in the cold. He carried the bundle out himself. The yard was sharp with frost. His boots found the frozen ruts in the stone, and he moved carefully, the bundle under one arm. Dara was at the cart, checking the harness with the methodical attention of someone who did this twice a day and didn't skip steps. She took the bundle from him and stowed it under the bench without comment. They spoke briefly about the road, the condition of the northern pass, whether the mud had frozen solid enough to take the weight. Dara said she'd come down that road 2 days ago, and it was passable if they kept to the crown. Hugo nodded. She went back to the harness. He turned around. Kryna was in the yard. She had come out while he was talking to Dara, and she stood a few feet from the cart with her cloak pulled close, the hood down despite the cold. Leta was behind her, already moving to stow the large backpack in the cart bed. Sibba was at the gate, looking out at the road with the focused interest of someone planning a journey. Hugo stood in the yard and looked at Kryna. The gray morning light was flat and even, the kind that showed things plainly. She looked back at him. He could see the road in her face. All the roads before this one, all the towns that had not been this town. All the doors that had opened differently. She had the amber eyes that didn't flinch, and she was not flinching now. But something in them was different from the first night. Less braced. Less prepared for the cost of a thing given. She took the bundle from under the cart bench. He started to say something. She looked at him, and he stopped. She put the bundle back under the bench herself, adjusted it so it sat flat, and stepped back. She looked at him and said they would come back along this road. When they traveled back, they would come this way. He heard it for what it was, Not a promise made lightly. She didn't make things lightly. A statement of intention, like the one she'd made about paying him back, carrying the same quiet weight. He looked at her and nodded once. Leta had the cart loaded. She climbed up to the bench beside Dara without ceremony, pulling her coat across her knees. Kryna went to the cart and put her hand on the sideboard and stepped up. Sibba was still at the gate. She had the horse out of her pocket. She was holding it up, level with her eyes, looking at it in the flat morning light the way she'd looked at it on the landing the first time, trying to understand it completely. Then she turned around. She looked at Hugo across the yard. She held the horse up so he could see it clearly. Then she put it back in her pocket, carefully, head first, and patted the pocket flat with her palm. She went to the cart and climbed in the back and arranged herself among the bundles with the competence of a child who had ridden in the backs of many carts. She pulled the wool length, his wool, from the linen store, across her knees and sat straight. Dara clicked to the horse. The cart moved. Hugo stood at the gate and watched it go. The road north was pale in the early light, the frozen mud holding the wheel tracks of the past week in rigid lines. The cart moved slowly at first, picking its way across the ruts at the gate, then steadied as it found the crown of the road, and Dara let the horse find its pace. He could see the back of Kryna's hood, the dark line of Leta's shoulders, the small, upright shape of Sibba in the cart bed. At the first bend in the road, where the stone wall of the miller's yard blocked the view, Sibba turned around. She had the horse out of her pocket again. She held it up, not waving it, just holding it level, visible, the way you hold up something so someone across a yard can see it clearly. Then the cart went around the bend, and the road was empty. Hugo stood at the gate for a moment. The frost was heavy on the stone posts. The yard behind him was quiet, Dara's hoof marks in the ice already beginning to blur at the edges where the morning was warming. He stood until the sound of the cart was gone, the creak of the axle, the careful hoof steps on frozen ground. And then there was nothing but the town waking up around him, the distant sound of the bakery, a dog somewhere on the next street. He went inside. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on the fire. He moved through the familiar sequence, the hook for his coat, the apron from the door, the cups from the shelf. His hands found the cups before his mind told them to. He set them on the table. 2 cups. He stood with his hand on the second one and looked at it. He didn't move it. He stood at the stove and waited for the kettle. Outside the kitchen window, the road was empty, the frost bright on the stone, the sky beginning to go from gray to the pale, thin blue of a cold autumn morning. The fire held its low breath behind him. The inn was quiet in the way it was always quiet. All that old stone, all that held warmth, all those empty rooms. He poured the water. He sat down at the table with 2 cups and put his hands around one and looked at the other, already cooling, already waiting for something it had no reason yet to expect. Some doors you close. Some you leave on the latch. You don't always know which is which until someone comes back down the road and knocks. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever let someone stay, or been let in when you didn't expect it, leave a like or find us again. We'll be here. New stories, same fire.